Why is Mikhail Gorbachev so revered in the U.S. and yet reviled at home?
On the one hand, Gorbachev shows that there is hope, but on the other hand, Gorbachev's experience shows that the hope is up against Russian tradition.
William Taubman will join us to talk about his new biography, Gorbachev, His Life and Times. How does our columnist N.K. Jemisin do it? She's our science fiction and fantasy columnist, and she just finished her Broken Earth trilogy, in the process winning 2 Hugo Awards for Best Novel in a row.
Fantasy and science fiction and all these other genres are still telling human stories. They're just not necessarily telling it with humans.
She'll join us here to talk about reading, writing, and reviewing science fiction and fantasy. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we're reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. William Taubman joins us now from Amherst, Massachusetts, where he is a professor emeritus of political science and a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Khrushchev. His new biography is of Gorbachev. That book, Gorbachev, His Life and Times, is reviewed this week in the book review by Peter Baker. Phil, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So your biography of Khrushchev came out in 2003. Have you been working on this biography since then?
Not quite. I got the idea in 2004 and approached Gorbachev in 2005. And then ever since, until I handed in the manuscript this last year, I've been working on it.
How important was it to you to have access to Gorbachev, to be able to interview him and talk to him in the process of writing the book?
It was very important, not only because I got to ask him a lot of questions about his life, but because I thought he answered them often more candidly than I expected. And I also got an impression of him as a person over the 8 times we talked. I have not met that many world leaders, in fact, probably none, prior to him, but he came across as natural, informal, funny. He didn't ask to preview the questions I was going to ask him. He didn't even ask that we bring or he provide an interpreter, because I was there knowing Russian, and my wife, Jane, who taught Russian literature and language at Amherst for 40-plus years, was there too.
So he's now 85 years old?
Let's see, he'll be 86 in March. No, 87. He'll be 87 in March.
And he lives in Moscow. Did you travel to Moscow each time to interview him?
Yes, we traveled to Moscow to interview him each time, but I also tracked him around to some other places where I got to talk to him, not formal interviews, but a conference in Turin in Italy, a conference in Venice, conference in New York, Washington. I stayed on his trail, as it were, as often as I could.
It was surprising to realize that your book, Gorbachev, His Life and Times, is really the first full-fledged biography of Mikhail Gorbachev. You would think it would have been done already.
Yes, I frankly was surprised, and I guess I should admit relieved that others weren't out there working in the same vineyard. I think the most interesting thing about that is that it hasn't been done in Russia. You would think that there, with access to him and all of the documentation and the other people, writers would have glommed onto it pretty quickly. And the only way I can explain it is to say that his name is in such disrepute in his country, not entirely, but among many, many people, that writers didn't want to touch it. It was too politicized. The views over there of Russians, or many of them, seemed so set in stone that if you praised him, you'd be going up against the consensus. And if you attacked him, you'd be seeming to say what is the conventional wisdom.
Well, that's nothing like American politics then. I mean, I think to many Americans, that's one of the things that's so surprising about Gorbachev, is that for people in the West, he's a kind of revered figure, and he's so reviled in Russia. Why is that?
Well, the people who remember those years, although they may remember with some gratitude and nostalgia the freedoms that he brought them, the overpowering memory, I'm afraid, is of the disintegration of the economy and the chaos that seemed to be coming on. And then not only what he delivered directly, but the years that followed, the collapse, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Yeltsin years, when things got even worse, because Yeltsin carried out economic shock therapy that reduced people's livelihoods even more than Gorbachev had. And there's a nostalgia for the Soviet Empire, I'm afraid to say. The Soviet Union is a superpower. And this nostalgia, among other things, helps to explain Putin's popularity.
Was Gorbachev at the time of Glasnost, at the time of Perestroika, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the Soviet Union, was he at that time also reviled, or was he initially popular during that period? And when did that tide turn?
No, he was extraordinarily popular when he first came in, because he was following in the footsteps of three, in effect, senile, fragile, dying predecessors. Brezhnev died in 82, Andropov died in 84. Chernenko, who replaced Andropov, could barely walk or breathe. So Gorbachev was a burst of fresh air, a young man, a smart man, articulate, charming. They loved him in the beginning. And as late as 1990, the beginning of 1990, he was still by far the most popular politician in Russia. But by the end of that year, 1990, he was trailing Yeltsin in popularity. And by 1991, he was very low on the totem pole. And by the time he was forced out of office, there were very few people who were sorry to see him go.
All right, let's go way back before we go into more detail in that era. When was he born and where?
He was born in a small village called Privolnaya in southern Russia, in the northern Caucasus area, the sort of steppe of southern Russia north of the Caucasus Mountains. He was born in March 1931. The biggest city nearby that most Westerners probably have never heard of is called Stavropol, and that's where Gorbachev made his career eventually in the party apparatus.
And what were his parents like? What was his childhood family life like?
His childhood family life turns out to be very interesting and important for understanding him later on. His parents were peasants. His father seems to have been a particularly sweet man, a good man. I get this not only from Gorbachev, but from others in that area who remembered him. And he was lovely to Gorbachev. He didn't try to dominate him. He loved him without ever saying he loved him, because Russian peasant patriarchs don't engage in that kind of talk. He supported him. He encouraged him. Gorbachev's mother, on the other hand, was much more strict and stern, and it turns out that when the disciplining in that family had to be done, she did it. And Gorbachev told me in an interview that she went so far as to whip him when she was upset with him, up until the age of 13, when he finally grabbed her arm and told her to stop. So that kind of combination of a benevolent, supportive father and a strict, overly strict mother, I think, had an effect. The way the father treated him encouraged him to believe that people were good and could be trusted, and to aspire to great things himself. And the way his mother treated him, I don't want to sound like an amateur psychologist, because I'm not credentialed, but I think the way his mother treated him may have created the need for the kind of affirmation that he later thought he deserved as a politician and that he got.
To get psychological just for a second, when you talk to Gorbachev about his childhood and about his life overall, how introspective is he and self-aware? Is he able to talk openly about his childhood, about his feelings, about his place in the world?
But when he described his relations with his mother, which I quote in the book, I was stunned, because I thought this was so interesting, and I even wondered on his behalf whether he should be sharing this with me. On the other hand, when you try to get at his sort of assessment of himself and his feelings about himself and his doubts about himself, he's not nearly as open and candid. He resists. And this even led to his saying to me at one point the words with which I begin the introduction of the book, which is, Gorbachev is hard to understand. I thought that was meaningful on several levels, but on one level, I thought he was telling me that he found himself hard to understand, And it turned out, and I quote this at the end of the introduction, that Alexander Yakovlev, his sort of closest comrade in the Politburo and his soulmate when it came to wanting reform and democratization in the Soviet Union, later said that he had the same impression, that Gorbachev shied away from self-scrutiny, as if he were afraid to discover things about himself. And that, of course, is a wonderful invitation for an amateur psychologist like me to engage in my own form of analysis, trying to find out what really made him tick.
So he's born a peasant in, outside of any major cities in Russia, in the North Caucasus. At what point does he start to distinguish himself? Was he a strong student? Did he stand out? What was his early career like?
Well, he was a strong student. He was a leader of the Young Communist League in his high school. He was a young politician. I think the most striking thing he did to stand out, he did together with his father when, in one of these sort of socialist competitions that the party ran, they had a battle to see who could bring in the most grain on a tractor pulling a combine. And Gorbachev and his father won. And Gorbachev describes, the sweat pouring from his brow and the 24 hours practically that they would work without stopping. Well, they won the competition, and as a result, he received something called the Red Labor Banner, signed by Joseph Stalin. And this made him a celebrity, not only in his province, in his town, in his school. He gave a speech at the ceremony honoring his achievements. So by the time he graduated, he was a very big man on a very small campus.
What's Gorbachev's life like now in Moscow? Is he wealthy? Is he a recluse? Does he socialize?
His life is in part to be admired and in part to be pitied. I mean, I admire the way he has stayed on in his own country rather than living abroad, which he could have done. The Germans in particular would have welcomed him. I admire the dignity with which he stepped down way back in 1991. I admire his effort to remain involved, to follow current events. If you look at his website, gorby.ru on the internet, he's constantly commenting on what's happening in Russia and the world.
And he had a book come out this year.
Yes, he has continued to write books from which I have learned a ton. The most recent one was translated into English just recently. But I pity him in the sense that he is alone, isolated. The most pitiful thing, I'm afraid, is that a man who relied so much on his wife for all the years until she died in 1999, and then on his daughter, who is a wonderful, educated woman, and her two daughters, now lives alone for the most part in a villa outside Moscow because she has moved for most of the time to Germany. Like her mother, she couldn't stand the barrage of slings and arrows which Gorbachev steeled himself to accept or to live through, if not accept. And so she finally decided she couldn't take it anymore and moved to Germany with her husband, who also needed German medical help. And although Gorbachev seems to have convinced himself that this is a good thing because she is now free of all this insult and attack and the attacks leveled against him, I'm sure it must be devastating to him to be living out his last months increasingly frail in this kind of isolation.
Last question, but kind of a big one, which is, obviously Russia is very much on the minds of Americans right now. But for the most part, it's, Putin, Putin, Putin. And so what would you say is the relevance of reading about Gorbachev's life, his own period, to understanding Russia today and its relationship with the West?
Well, one thing I'd say is that Gorbachev shows that there is hope for democracy in Russia. The 5 years that he presided over the Soviet Union, he tried to introduce it, and that was welcomed at the time by the majority of the population. And some public opinion polling still shows that in the abstract, Russians think that democracy is a good idea. So on the one hand, Gorbachev shows that there is hope, but on the other hand, Gorbachev's experience shows that the hope is up against Russian traditions of authoritarianism and anti-Westernism that Putin has taken advantage of to build up his popularity to almost unprecedented heights. Gorbachev tried to lead his country in a kind of Western way, civilized way. He was willing to change his mind. He was willing to listen. Putin is a reversion to the old ways. And he's partly so popular because so many Russians have decided from their experience under Gorbachev and under Yeltsin that they need a strong hand like Putin, almost as if they themselves, left alone with the kind of leadership that Gorbachev provided and even Yeltsin tried to continue, would be lost. And that's very sad, both for Russia and the world.
So I want to add to your own reasons as to why this book is so relevant now, a quote from Peter Baker's review of your book, which he calls masterly. He says that this book should come out now is fortuitous as Americans debate Russia's role in the world and in our own political system. To understand today's Russia, it is necessary to understand what happened during Gorbachev's time, how he opened up a hermetically sealed society after 70 years of stifling communist rule, but was unable to solve its deeper problems and was ultimately pushed aside by the ambitious and mercurial Boris Yeltsin, and of course, Putin then to follow, which certainly adds to the argument for the timeliness of this book. So, Bill, congratulations again on your new biography of Gorbachev, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, I like Peter Baker's verdict on the book.
And Kay Jemisin joins us now to talk about many things, her otherworldly science fiction and fantasy column, her new trilogy, which is a New York Times bestseller now with its third book, The Stone Sky, and her recent win of the Hugo Award for the second year in a row. So many things to discuss. Nora, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this is your first time on the podcast, but you've been our otherworldly fantasy and science fiction columnist now for, I think, 2 years.
A little over 2 years, actually.
Yeah, and we've never talked about it.
I'd been doing sort of just freelance stuff before that, before it became an official otherworldly column with its own name.
Yes. Well, we love it, and our readers love it. So I'd love to just talk a little bit generally about that column and your approach to it and how you pick books and what your process is. So tell us about it.
Well, mostly I just pick books that I actually want to read. And I just kind of focus on the fact that untested biases tend to be the ones that perpetuate a lot of problems. So even though I'm just kind of picking books based on what I want to read, I sort of do some number crunching to make sure that, I'm not picking all white guys or all one particular demographic. I'm picking something that feels to me like it's cutting edge within the genre, that feels to me like it is actually representative of the genre, and so on. And I prefer to pick books that I actually enjoy because I don't want to do hate reviews. I'm not interested in that. My favorite columns are the ones where I actually enjoyed all 4 of the books in the column.
It's interesting because when you say the genre, it's actually, there are multiple genres because it's not only fantasy, but it's science fiction. And for the most part, those are kind of 2 different things.
Yeah.
And then within fantasy, you have high fantasy, and science fiction has I don't know, 20 subcategories. And then, of course, they all now intermingle with, what we might call literary fiction. So how do you think of those categories? And do you try to, sort of have a little bit of each?
I kind of don't. I've discovered that I haven't been doing enough fantasy, actually. When I sat down and actually did some number crunching, I'm a fantasy writer, and I apparently have an issue with reading fantasy. So I've got to kind of try and, balance that out a little better and do a little less science fiction, just to kind of make sure I'm maintaining that balance. But beyond that, I don't really parse the genre out that way. And I'm not sure outside of booksellers really who does. Maybe booksellers and some very anxious literary types that don't want to be classified as genre. But genre readers just kind of go with, is it cool? Is it vaguely speculative? Does it sound interesting? Let's read it. And I think that kind of eclecticism is is more typical. Maybe that's just my own personal perspective cropping up again.
Do you feel the need to, I have to weigh in on this big book, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, because everyone's kind of want to know about it, even though it might not be to my particular taste? Or do you try to go with more your own?
I do a little of that. There are times when I will pick up a big book that everybody's talking about, specifically because everybody's talking about it. Like I said, I don't like doing hate reviews. There are certain things within the genre that everybody's got their own little personal bugaboos about. And my bugaboos tend to be with things that are seen too often or done too much and cliched. So I will reject some books frequently because they're popular and everyone's talking about them. Not because people are talking about them, but because they're a little too middle of the road for me.
How important is that kind of innovative storytelling and, sort of genre creation and genre busting to you?
Well, there's me as a writer and there's me as a reader. Me as a reader is bored with everything and just constantly looking for something sort of weird, I guess, weirder than the usual weird within this genre. Me as a writer recognizes the fact that, there is no true originality. Everything's been done. And in a lot of cases, the thing that lends that flavor of newness is simply telling the same story from a different perspective or focusing on an aspect of that story that hasn't really been touched before. So that's the kind of thing that draws me. And, sure, I'm sure that with everything I've been reviewing, you can find someone who's done it before. The question is, who's the person that's done that? In this new case, is that a person whose voice we haven't seen or heard from very much within the genre? Do they bring a new perspective to the genre? Are they focusing on a different aspect of the story versus, what's been done before? And so that's the thing that's gonna pull me.
One of the perceptions, and I will admit to having this perception myself from my own reading experience, limited reading experience of fantasy, is that it's just so incredibly complicated. For me, I sometimes think I have a hard enough time grasping my own world, let alone one in which, there are tentacled creatures and, third dimensions and fourth dimensions and 18th dimensions. I often find that the little fantasy that I do read is YA because it's at least somewhat, simplified for a rough and, maybe immature mind.
Is it?
I don't know. Well, some of it's very complicated. I'm reading a fairly complicated YA novel right now that has a lot of fantasy elements by Kristen Kishore, and her first trilogy, the Graceling trilogy. I wonder if you find that as an author. Your work also is
pretty complicated.
It's pretty complex. Yes.
Yeah. I know.
And sometimes when your reviews come in, we joke a little bit that when we read your reviews, it's so clarifying and we understand it all while we're reading it, and then we put it down and we're like, I don't know what that was about. As a writer and as a reader, how important is it that there be that complexity, and also that it be consistent and be comprehensible? And is that something that you find is a failing of some fantasy, that it builds a world but then either breaks the rules of that world or overcomplicates it?
That does happen, but we usually decry that as bad fantasy. So one of the goals of fantasy has been the successful creation of another world, the creation of the sense of wonder. The idea is that if you are sufficiently dazzling your reader with the uniqueness of the world and the coolness of the concepts, then the reader's going to engage with the story in a way that you can't engage with realistic literature. With realistic literature, you're going to inevitably pattern your own life onto that. You're going to engage with the story and think, okay, well, I dealt with this, so I get it. The point here is to pull you into something that's outside of your comfort zone and then make you engage with what are the same stories ultimately. Because, fantasy and science fiction and all these other genres are still telling human stories. They're just not necessarily telling it with humans.
As a writer, did you always want to write fantasy, or were you tempted by realistic fiction?
Not really. I always sort of jokingly say I started reading fairy tales and then never stopped. And I did stop. I spent a period where I did nothing but realist literature reading, kind of thinking, that's where serious literature is and I should read serious literature. And, I got bored. I was also beginning to realize that you can do realism in fantasy. You can do realism in science fiction. In fact, it makes the science fiction and fantasy that much more powerful when you do. And most science fiction and fantasy, historically, it's been perceived as escapist literature that's not trying to be realistic. But that's never been the whole of the genre. And it's more and more clear that that's not where the genre is now. And so, I think for me, reading Octavia Butler was the point where I realized you could fuse reality with science fiction in ways that worked really well. I, as a teenage black girl in the 1980s in a small southern town who spent her summers in New York, and this is the summers of Crown Heights riots and Tawana Brawley and all that stuff. What I was seeing in my world was not being reflected in my favorite literature. Mm-hmm. I'd started reading realist literature because that was the only place I could see that reflection. But then I began to find sociological science fiction and realized that those two fields could actually blend, and I could find something to relate to in a setting that still is going to pull in my imagination and my sense of wonder and encourage me to think outside of the usual patterns of real life.
Your current trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy, I feel like there's so much good news about it. It's hard to summarize in one sentence. So let me just list it out. It's being turned into a TV series, yep. Correct? Mm-hmm. You won the Hugo Award for Best Novel with the first one, the fifth season in 2016? 2015.
Well, it was for a 2015 publication. The award happened.
The award was in 2016.
Yeah.
What's shocking, and maybe you can tell us more, but that you were the first African American to win that.
Yeah, the first black person to win for Best Novel.
Okay.
Both Octavia Butler and Chip Delaney, Samuel, he publishes as Samuel Delaney, had won for shorter fiction.
And then for the Obelisk Gate, mm-hmm. you just won for the second time and the second year in a row.
Yeah.
And the third book, The Stone Sky, which came out in August, mm-hmm. just made the New York Times bestseller list, which is your first time on the list.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of excitement.
It's a lot of good stuff happening. I'm a little stunned by all of it. Third books of trilogies don't usually make bestseller lists if the first book didn't. And so I don't really know what to think of all of this. It's a good thing. It's wonderful stuff. It has meant that my promotion calendar got so packed that basically I haven't written in a month. I've been doing interviews and appearances, and all day I'm kind of wrestling with businessy stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good. It's definitely a good problem to have, but
So when you finished writing the trilogy, how did you feel?
Relieved,
mm-hmm.
tired. I am mostly satisfied with it. I am a typical writer who constantly self-edits. I went back and realized one chapter really should have been a lot shorter. But anyway, so I'm still kind of constantly self-editing, and I don't know that I'll ever be 100% satisfied with something, but I struggled with this series. It was my attempt to do a number of things I had never done before. It was me kind of deliberately pushing past where I thought my comfort zone as a writer was, and possibly pushing beyond my ability or my level of skill at that point in time.
What were those things that you hadn't done before that you wanted to do?
Oh, I'd never tackled second person.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never tackled one contiguous story across 3 books as opposed to 3 separate stories kind of forming a mosaic trilogy. I'd never done a story focused on a middle-aged mother, and I'm middle-aged, but I don't have any kids. So I was trying to tackle issues of motherhood when I'm not a mother.
Multi-tentacled creatures may be more easier to grasp.
I had some thoughts on that, but I am an auntie, and that's not the same thing by any stretch. I give them back when they start crying or getting in trouble, But there are aspects of motherhood that are universal. And I was also engaging with my own mother, and I'll speak of this very briefly, but my mother passed away earlier this year.
I'm sorry.
And I realize in retrospect, because I realize this whenever I am writing something, I realize it years later what I'm actually writing about.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the warning signs of what was happening with my mother physically were on the wall when I started this series, and I think that was why that material pulled me. I find myself kind of using fiction as therapy and chewing on concepts that are too hard to articulate and sometimes maybe too personal or too difficult to confront. So I found myself kind of chewing on all of that in this fiction. So that was part of it. At the end of the day, though, I'm satisfied with the fact that, the trilogy captured what I was hoping to capture. I tried to do this thing that probably was a little beyond my skill when I started it, and I feel like I was able to at least come up to where it needed me to be, mostly up to where it needed me to be. There's some things that, really, like, that last chapter really should have been edited. But anyway.
Everyone has those regrets.
So there's a couple of chapters that I would have shrunk down. But other than that, it was okay.
So now what?
Now I have started working on, when I have some time to write again. I've started finally, though, working on a novel, which I am currently outlining as 3 novels, but I don't know how I'm feeling about 3 novels again. We'll see.
I would think that you would want like a palate cleanser of a standalone or...
I have trouble thinking in short fiction or shorter fiction. Trilogies are easy for me. But this one will be based on a short story that I wrote and published through Tor.com maybe 2 years ago called The City Born Great. And that will actually be a story set in New York City with some magic and eldritch abominations and stuff added.
All right. Well, once you're done with being on podcasts, you can get back to working on that. I can now call you a New York Times bestselling author, a 2-time Hugo Award winner, and our otherworldly columnist. Nora, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Kay Jemisin is our science fiction and fantasy columnist, and her newest book is called The Stone Sky. It came out in August. It's on our bestseller list. It's the final book in her Broken Earth trilogy. Alexander Alter joins us now to talk about the latest in publishing, which this week means scandals and lawsuits.
Scandals and lawsuits. It's another one of those weeks.
You're more than welcome to be here.
Thank you. There were 2 very interesting intellectual property lawsuits that came up recently. Both involve major authors' estates. One is Tom Clancy and the other one is John Steinbeck. And both of them involve kind of clashing over rights to characters and copyrights. The John Steinbeck case is sort of fascinating because it's been dragging on for decades, ever since his death in the late 60s when he left the bulk of his estate to his 3rd wife, Elaine Steinbeck. At the time, he just gave each of his sons from a previous marriage $50,000. And so all the copyrights and rights to adapt the work were with his then 3rd wife, Elaine. When she passed away, the rights for that passed to her daughter, who is his stepdaughter. And this week...
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's interesting.
That's part of
That's not fair, I guess
well,
some would say.
Well, you can imagine, quickly after his passing, his sons sued for more rights, and they were eventually granted a portion of the royalties. They later reached a settlement with his widow to basically split the royalties with her. But now this fight has gone on for so long that the 2 women involved, neither of them are a blood relative of John Steinbeck. You have on one side his stepdaughter, Waverly Scott Kafaga, and that is the daughter of Elaine Steinbeck, who passed away in 2003. And on the other side, you have his daughter-in-law, Gail Steinbeck, who was married to his son, Tom Steinbeck, who died last year. And Gail Steinbeck married Tom after John Steinbeck had already passed away, so she never actually knew him. And yet these are the 2 figures who are now clashing over rights to the estate. In particular, they're fighting over who has the right to sell film adaptation rights and theater adaptation rights. So this suit was brought by his stepdaughter, Waverly Scott Kafaga, in 2014. She basically filed a suit because she said that Gail Steinbeck was interfering with her plans to sell the film rights for East of Eden and Grapes of Wrath.
That gives us so many headline opportunities with the word wrath.
It's fascinating. And so a jury this week awarded the stepdaughter, Waverly Scott Kafaga, more than $13 million in damages, which is an extraordinary amount. And part of that is supposed to be lost profits, compensatory damages for the film right deals, which she said were complicated and muddied by Gail Steinbeck's efforts to interfere with the adaptations. And the other part is punitive damages. Gail Steinbeck says she's going to file an appeal. She says, there's still copyright protections for her and that come through her late husband. So it's going to be interesting to see if any of these movies ever get made. And, there are big names attached. There were these witnesses that were supposed to appear but didn't, included the filmmaker Ron Howard, the actor James Franco, Brian Grazer, the producer. These were all supposed to be called as witnesses. They didn't appear. But Steven Spielberg has optioned The Grapes of Wrath. And it looks like that could, if this ever gets resolved, go forward, actually.
Wow.
So that was one extremely convoluted family affair. When you think
of John Steinbeck, you naturally next think of Tom Clancy.
Exactly. They're often paired. Well, in a way, I mean, they're both incredibly significant, right? I mean, they have these iconic works. And in the case of Tom Clancy's estate...
Very American.
Very
works.
American. The Tom Clancy legal dispute was recently brought by his widow, Alexandra Clancy. She filed a lawsuit to claim copyright of the Jack Ryan character. And she wants to demonstrate that that character is owned entirely by the Tom Clancy estate. And this is something that has been in dispute for a while. After his novel The Hunt was published in 1984, that's the novel that was adapted into The Hunt for Red October, the United States Naval Institute, which is a publisher, asserted that it owned all the rights to that character and that book. Mm-hmm. And so this dispute has been going on for a long time. And Alexandra Clancy is now attempting to regain copyright protections for the Jack Ryan character. So we'll see where that lawsuit goes. That one is just getting started, so it could be several years.
All right, to be continued. Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Jen Salai join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right. This is going to be the Pronunciation Challenge Week edition of the book review because, let's start with Jen, and she'll show why.
Thank you. So the book that I'm reading right now is a book by a Hungarian author named Dezső Kosztolányi.
Very nice.
Thank you. And the title is Skylark, and it was a book that he wrote, I believe he wrote it in the 1920s, which is when he wrote several of his novels, but it's set in 1899, and it's about this couple who send their adult daughter off to a vacation on the plains, basically. And so until then, it seems like they've led a very sort of staid, somewhat stultifying life, and when she leaves, they sort of have an insane amount of fun. Like they go to the theater, they eat at a restaurant, which is like a really big deal. He buys his wife some chocolates, which is also a big deal. And then they also see this musical. So right now I'm sort of at the part where they've just received a letter from her where she's telling them what she's been up to. So I feel like it's building towards something, but I'm not totally
terrible.
Sure. Unclear, probably, but you never know.
It's Jen, and so something drew you to this book. What did draw you to this book?
So about a decade ago, I had read a book by him called Anna Édes, which is really an amazing novel about another couple. But this is, in Anna Édes, the couple is sort of a really sadistic, unpleasant employers of this maid, and it's about this maid and her relationship with them. And this was something that I had bought used at the time, and I had always meant to read it, and we kept it on our shelf, and then we moved stuff around, and then somehow it popped up. I found it in my home, and I thought, you know what? I'm feeling a little melancholy. It's time to read some melancholy Hungarians. So
it also
here
seems
we are.
like
Clarify, in case it's not already apparent to our listeners, that you are half Hungarian.
Right, so I can say that.
I feel like that's appropriate for back to school reading too, like a couple that's freed up by.
Well, actually, this also, the date when she leaves is September 1st, 1899. So I thought, okay. It's all coming together.
I read both the books that Greg and Jen are reading this week. Although,
oh, you did?
Yeah, and Skylark is in the New York Review of Books Classics series. And the version I have in that series is much thinner than the copy you have. So I didn't think it was the same book. But
that one's from the Central European Classics.
Yeah.
But it's the same translation, I actually think. Because I saw when NYRB, they reissued it
with the same
6 or 7 years ago.
Maybe she's reading the large print edition.
I read it.
Well, the paper on this is extremely, it's like construction paper.
Very thick.
I don't know
why.
Back to school theme.
I know. I don't know why. But
who's the translator?
This one is Richard Oxel, who I think is, it must be the
Maybe
same
I can
edition.
look at home.
I think
Yeah,
it's
I
Richard
read it a few years
Oxel.
ago. I don't remember much about it actually, but I'm also reading a New York Review of Books classic this week because in addition to the big jazz biographies I talked about last week, I wanted something else that I could finish quickly. Those are things I think I'm going to be reading in for a little while.
Wait, did you watch Elevator to the
No, I
Gallows?
haven't yet. I need to. We'll bring that up on a future. We'll have a movie edition of the podcast.
Yes. Okay.
What happened was a couple of weeks ago, our colleague Matthew Schneier, who's a styles reporter for The Times and just a really great, funny writer and a great reader, wrote this appreciation of the British novelist Barbara Pym, P-Y-M.
Can I just interject that about 10 people wanted to write appreciations of Barbara Pym?
Of her in particular?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, she does have a cult, and that, he sort of said that the cult revives every so often and her name gets... And what I realized was that not only have I not read Barbara Pym, but I also hadn't read a writer that I confuse her with, another Barbara, who's a slightly neglected British novelist named Barbara Comyns, C-O-M-Y-N-S.
One of the half-forgotten British Barbaras.
She's another half-forgotten Barbara. So I picked up one of the two that I have, which is from New York Review Books, and it's called Our Spoons Came from Woolworths. She's great at titles. The other book that I want to read of hers soon is called Who Was Changed and Who Was Dead.
These are great titles.
They're
That is
great
really
titles.
good.
Although probably her best-known book, which is also in this series, is just called The Vet's Daughter.
That's pretty good.
That's an okay title. That's not quite as good as these two. But this book is about, it's a fairly short book. It's about a woman named Sophia who marries a man named Charles when they're both 21. And they have this the book is funny because it's written in this sort of naive, wide-eyed tone, but these terrible things happen. So Sophia, the narrator, almost seems very innocent, and she's relating, at first she thinks there's this widely quoted line where she thinks that thinking really hard that you don't want to have a baby is what birth control means. And then she says, I found out quickly that wasn't true. And there's a very harrowing scene in here where she gives birth, and it's kind of a report from a previous time where it was a bit more harrowing. And it's funny because there's this italic line on the copyright page that I only noticed this morning, which says, and I assume she wrote this, it says, "The only things that are true in this story are the wedding and chapters 10, 11, and 12, and the poverty." And 10 and 11 and 12 are the story of her giving birth in the hospital. And it's pretty graphic for a book that is so sort of innocent toned the rest of the time. And it's a little jarring, actually. So I'm about halfway through. And like Jen's template, I feel like even worse things are going to happen to her. I mean, her husband's he's an artist, and he ends up being a jerk who, sort of gets colder toward her after she gives birth and doesn't want to have the kid and hates that it's a boy. And so they have a lot of discord, but so far it's good. I mean, it's not blowing me away like some of the things I've recently talked about on the podcast, but I'll definitely read more of hers, finish this, and then read more of hers. So Greg is going to win the pronunciation Olympics very easily.
I've got an easy one. After I finished Italo Calvino last week, I was kind of casting about for what the next book would be. I almost picked up to reread Michael Ondaatje's book, Coming Through Slaughter, because I had just recommended it to John after he finished Jeff Dyer's But Beautiful. Coming Through Slaughter is Michael Ondaatje's novel about the early jazz trumpeter and innovator Buddy Bolden in New
I had no idea that
Orleans.
book was about jazz.
Yeah, it's very much about kind of New Orleans in the late 19th, early 20th century and kind of the confluence of musical styles that came together there, and Buddy Bolden as this forgotten and crazy but genius musician there. I was this close to rereading that book when my wife said, "Oh, you're looking for something to read. You should read Lily King's Euphoria." And I don't know what made her suggest that at this time. It's a book that the book review named as one of the 10 best books a couple of years ago.
You're now outing yourself as not having...
Well, I wasn't the assigning editor on it. I kind of went along for the ride saying, sure, we can make that one of the best. I had looked at it enough at the time to recognize its skill, its beauty, and it is a very skillful and very beautifully written book. But I had not read it completely at that time as just as a reader.
As one does.
Yeah.
Or does not.
And so I'm now finally reading it. What's interesting is also earlier this year I read Norman Rush's Mating, and both of those books are books about anthropologists. And it had me thinking in the early pages of this, why don't more novelists write about anthropologists? There's something very parallel in the project of being a novelist and being an anthropologist, where you're trying to just describe how people live within the culture. And So there's something very fruitful in writing about anthropology from the novelist's imagination. And it's a fictionalized version of a true story. It's a woman anthropologist who in the book is named Nell Stone, and two male anthropologists that they form a love triangle in New Guinea in the 1930s. And it's based very much on the actual story of Margaret Mead and her husband and anthropologists who were all in that part of the world at that time. It does actually have a little bit of a Michael Ondaatje vibe to it, too. I'm not reading Coming Through Slaughter, but it's got a little bit of that English patient love triangle in the 1930s, or, that time of the century. It opens in third person from Nell Stone's perspective, but it shifts very quickly to the third wheel, the man who's not the husband in the love triangle. And it tells his story, how he came to be an anthropologist, how he came to be in New Guinea, and how he comes to be involved with Nell Stone. And so it's mostly written in the first person from his perspective, although it shifts and we get parts of Nell Stone's journal entries. I would put this book in as one of the best books of a couple of years ago.
You're retroactively.
See, that's why we did. That was your book, wasn't it, Jen?
It was. That's right.
Yeah, so good call.
Pamela, pronounce
so did
something for us.
Summarize it properly?
Oh, yeah.
All right. I am reading Jane Unlimited, which I mentioned last week by Kristen Kishore, and I don't want to talk about it too much because she'll be joining us on the podcast next week. But what I can say is interesting as an experience is that this is one of the few books that my daughter read before I did. And not only did she read it, but she read it twice before I read it. And it's a little bit of a challenge for a number of reasons. One, because now I know that she already knows stuff that I actually wish she maybe didn't know, but I'm finding out too late, And when I brought it home, I hadn't been planning to not let her read it, because I don't generally try to hold things back, but I wasn't going to introduce it to her, because the previous trilogy, which I really liked by Kristen Kishore, this one is a standalone, Jane Unlimited, but was for 14 or 15 and older for good reason. And I had a feeling that was the appropriate age for
and
this
how old
book
is your
too.
daughter?
Yeah, it's age 14 and up. She's 12, so she's close. And I generally tend to be pretty loose with that kind of thing with movies too, often because I want to watch the movies myself. So I'll be like, come here and let's watch Interstellar.
Clockwork Orange.
Yes, that I have held back. Although I did see that before I was 12, very inappropriately.
Really? Yeah,
we do have to have
favorite
that
movie.
That was about.
We do have to have a movie podcast.
All right, we will have a movies based on books
Yeah.
podcast coming up. Stay tuned. But so there are things in here that I thought, must it depict sex in precisely this way? And but the other part that's made it challenging is that my daughter the idea of plot spoiling does not exist for her except to spoil it and then think that she didn't do anything wrong. And she's one of those people that will often flip to the last page of a book. Oh. And when we're watching a movie, she's like, what's happening? I don't understand. What's going to happen 10 minutes from now? She just needs to know. And so she really, really, really wants to talk about the book with me. And she doesn't want to wait until I'm done. So she'll be like, okay, I promise this isn't going to be, a plot spoiling question, but don't you think it just gets crazier and crazier as it goes along? And I'm like, that's a spoiler. That is still kind of a spoiler.
I thought it might get calmer as it went along. Now I know that it doesn't.
Inadvertently revealed too much. So hopefully by next week, I'll not only be able to talk about the book more with Kristen Kishore, the author, but also with my daughter.
Very nice.
Until then.
That's cute.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.